Let's look at the ID selector. So let's save our file and we'll use the same class and we'll convert into an ID selector. Okay, we'll call it as ID. And how do you define an ID selector? Instead of dot, you mention hash. Okay, so we're going to convert all these things into ID selectors. So we can create same name, one with class and one with even ID selector. Okay, similarly for the green border, we'll create one more ID selector. Even for H1 italics. For this one, we can create the similar names. And also for H1.green border, how you think we're gonna write the ID selector? So instead of dot, you mention hash. That's all you have to do. Alright, so let's start applying the rule. Okay, there is a difference between ID and the class because you see you have same rules, one with ID and one with class. So you have to understand what is the difference between ID and the class. So we're going to discuss some of the differences here and we'll also understand how to apply ID. Okay, so for ID you have a property called ID and you just have to mention the property name. So I'll say green border and I'm gonna say ID selector custom name, right? And similarly you can mention class. Okay, same green border, you can say ID selector, this is nothing but the class selector custom name, right? You just have to say class, right? So you have the green borders, it's just selected, that's why the color changes, but it's both basically the green borders, right? Now what is the difference? You cannot have multiple rules for ID selector. Let's say you want to do text italics, okay, and you save it, it's not applied it here. Actually the rule itself is gone, right? But if you do same thing for class selector, that's possible. So remember this difference. For ID selector you have to have one selector, you cannot have multiple selectors with the spaces. Okay, once you do that, means the actual rule will be gone. It consider everything as one selector, right? For class you can loop the selectors with the spaces. Okay, that's one of the differences. And ID should only be one per element, you cannot have two per element. Okay, so let's quickly write those as a comment so you understand the difference between ID selectors and class selectors. ID should be only one per element, that's what we saw previously. Okay, and IDs are unique, you cannot duplicate it, you're gonna see that. Then each element can only have one ID, you cannot have multiple IDs. And each page at the page level can have only element with that ID. Okay, you cannot even duplicate the ID at the page level. Okay, I'm going to show you that what that example means. All right, so what is this rule that says IDs are unique? Okay, you should not create something like this. Okay, you should not repeat IDs inside the same element. You can repeat the ID in the different elements, but don't try to make a habit of writing IDs of the same elements. All right, it won't take much impact, but the way it is ID is being used, ID is basically an identifier for your element. And if you go to JavaScript, ID is basically will be a reference point of this element in the DOM. So typically when we write ID, we tend to have unique names, we don't want to duplicate names. You'll have challenges when you want to mention IDs for your element, that is nothing but the reference names of your element. And if you duplicate it, then it's hard to find unique elements in the HTML pages. So it's always recommended the IDs should be unique. So most of the time you will find yourself to work with classes, because classes, once you mention, then you can have multiple selectors using the classes. The other benefits which we're going to discuss, and also ID is nothing but a reference of an element, so typically you use it for referring that element. Okay, and make sure you don't duplicate IDs for each of the elements. Okay, so let's look some of the differences between ID and CSS. Let's get a new file and find some differences there.